Welcome to Energy Thinks, a podcast about the oil and gas industry's role in the energy future. I'm Tisha Schuller, your host and the CEO of Adamantine Energy. We are at a pivotal time, a time I'm calling the moment. And I am obsessed with a few things. And if you've been listening to this show or reading my work, you'll know that as forces are conspiring to lay bare the myth of a simple energy transition, there is a lot for us to do, and there's a lot for us to not do. And so I'm obsessed with three ideas, which we'll talk about with today's guest. One is this idea that during any political pendulum swing, it's really important that we not overcorrect, because if we know that things like this moment is transient, then we have to be ready for what comes next. And that means thinking about enduring policy, enduring positions, enduring strategy, and more on that in a second. I'm also really interested in how we could make progress on things that matter, like reducing emissions, like building more energy under a Trump administration by perhaps depoliticizing these things, not doubling down on how politicized things are. And then the third thing I'm obsessed with right now is the courage to speak up to your own colleagues, to your in-group, because that's how we actually make sure that we resist our worst impulses of a moment and we come back to the middle. So that's why I wanted to speak today, all those things, with Arnab Datta. So he's the managing director of policy implementation at Employ America. He's the director of infrastructure policy at the Institute for Progress. He'll tell you more about those organizations in our show, and you can read more about him in our show notes. If you are interested in following this subject more, I hope you will go to energythinks.com and sign up for my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. And I hope that you will enjoy my conversation today with Arnab Datta. Arnab Datta, thank you so much for joining me on the Energy Thinks podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back.
It was a pleasure having you. Last time we talked about the book I wrote in 2022, Real Decarbonization. And now I'm working on my next book, The Moment. And as you'll hear in our conversation, I'm struggling with some of the themes given all the craziness in the world. And so I really want to get your take on it. But first, let's set the stage. So the audience has grown. Everyone might not be as familiar with your work and some of your recent publications. So tell our audience a little bit about your background and the work that you do on energy policy.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you again for having me. It's great to be back. I grew up in Calgary. I live in Washington, D.C. I have a brief stint in the oil industry, but currently I work at two organizations. One is Employ America, and the other is the Institute for Progress. At Employ America, we work to advocate for macroeconomic policy that supports full employment. So, an economy with high employment, rising wages, and worker power. And a lot of our work, and particularly over the last 3-4 years, I would say, has been on energy policy, particularly oil and other commodities, because of their importance to macroeconomic outcomes. If you asked me to tell you a picture of the state of the macroeconomic environment with two indicators, I'd probably pick, the Federal Reserve's interest rate and also the WTI price. Oil is just, so central to our economy in so many ways. And so, because of its unique importance, the fact that oil shocks often put us into recessions, that oil prices play a huge role across the economy in inflation and pricing, it's something that we spend a lot of time on stability and pricing in the oil industry. The other organization I work at, the Institute for Progress, works to advance scientific, industrial, and technological progress. And so I'm the director of infrastructure policy there. We spend a lot of time on energy policy, particularly accelerating next generation energy technologies. One particular area that we spent a lot of time on working is on permitting reform and how to basically remove permitting barriers that harm energy technology acceleration. Specifically, we've worked on this problem that we've described as the litigation doom loop, which is this endless cycle of environmental review and litigation, largely driven by kind of procedural laws, federal laws, that stifles the build out of energy infrastructure and increases the costs, and I think is really putting us at a competitive disadvantage. So that's my background. That's who I work with and how I work on energy policy.
Well, and I'll provide our listeners with a little insight why you're one of my go-to people, and I'm trying to make sense of a crazy world. And that's because your two organizations, if you just looked at the names, you would think, okay, this guy is sort of like a traditional lefty. Not to typecast you, Arnab, but I'm going to typecast you for a second. And yet, the conversations we've had, the conversation we're about to have, is really about scrambling some of these. I think. These sort of ideas of like what's lefty and what's right. And certainly we're recording this on the week that Donald Trump was inaugurated, in a world that I think we can all agree a lot of the traditional expectations around like what's left and what's right have become scrambled. And so that I'm really excited to talk to you today about this world we find ourselves in, and also the courage required to be a part of progress and not being a part of stagnation or entrenched fighting. So when you were here last time, we had a really interesting conversation about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Again, not something that most people associate with something like full employment and the centrality of affordability or keeping, inflation low. So can you just give us an update of where are you with that? And what are your thoughts about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve going into the Trump administration and the likely our likely new Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright? Like what do you think happens next around that?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, so, last time we chatted about this, I think we talked a lot about our advocacy here, which, publicly really began in wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the, further spike in energy prices there. And we were really focused on what can we do to, we saw this investment response from domestic producers that was, not sensitive to prices rising. There wasn't certainty in the market, so you didn't see investment really recover. And so we advocated to use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve's acquisition to refill it essentially in a manner that would boost domestic oil production, that you could, provide some certainty to the market. So the DOE finalized a rule that allowed it to engage in that type of contractual acquisition through fixed price forward contracts. And I think around the last time we spoke, they had tried or announced a pilot to acquire this way with 3 million barrels. And that pilot ultimately failed. What happened was the bids that came in from producers were about $20 higher than the WTI price at the time. And so it was an important inflection moment because they didn't just give up. They went back, they fixed some problems in the contractual structure. I mean, the reason the bids came in so much higher is they had this 2-week period where producers basically had to put a lot of kind of premiums on the prices that they were giving because they were exposed to one-sided optionality that was entirely, at the exercise of the DOE. There's a contango premium, there's a differential premium, there's a delivery premium. I'm sure a lot of your listeners know that WTI clears in Cushing, but you either have to go through the Netherlands terminal to get to the Big Hill SPR site, or you have to do it through freight and deliver. And so, all those costs were baked in, but the DOE went back, changed this, fixed a lot of this. And since that time, they've used this structure, this new contract type to refill, about 60 million barrels in total. And, some of that is also returned exchanges. But more importantly, they were able to extend their forward price, contract term to 9 months. So we're getting closer to the shale production cycle. And so, they've run out of money, but they do have this, tool that they've tested now that they can do in a way that kind of more matches the production cycle, comes closer to the production cycle of the U.S. shale sector. So I think looking forward, President Trump has said he wants to refill the SPR. And I think that that's good, but, it's important. One thing we've said from the beginning is it's important to realize that the storage space in the SPR is as much an asset as the oil in the SPR itself. It's that, if the market crashes, we've got that storage space that we can, act as the buyer of last resort and stop the, shale sector from going bankrupt as it has, as it did in the 2018-19 period. I think Secretary Wright, or Secretary Incoming Wright, I guess, I guess he hasn't been confirmed yet, is someone who understands this. He understands he comes from the shale world. He understands the sector. And so I hope that there's a partner there where you could see, a smart refill, one that is utilized to like strengthen the U.S. shale sector globally and make sure that it's not, that we can keep producing here.
The reason this topic is interesting, and I just want to commend you on using words that pull on the heartstrings and love language of my audience, like tango and cushion.
Yeah.
So this conversation is nuanced. It's complicated. There's no easy answer around keeping oil prices stable for either producers or consumers. Like these things are wildly complicated. They defy sometimes the logic of at least politics. And so as a tee up to our next conversation, where I want to talk about the piece you had in the New York Times at the end of last year, but to tee that up, I'm curious if you get pushback from your colleagues on the political left, just about your willingness to talk about the importance of oil, the importance of talking about both production and keeping producers in business. I'll give just a quick anecdote. I was on the earlier this week, I was on a ski lift with just like a random person having a random conversation. And within 1 minute, this is in Boulder County, Colorado, they said, well, we just have to get all oil and gas today. And I thought, I cannot believe this is I cannot believe this is happening right now. And two, it's just so entrenched as like a go-to comment. Here we are, like probably on a diesel operated ski lift. Never mind that.
Right.
An hour's drive from everything. On a day that's 5 degrees. And so I'm just curious, and that it just caught me as how strong this on the same week that Trump is being inaugurated. There's just like the logic is so strong and absolute. And I imagine you run into that all the time. So how was that SPR work received?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll be honest with you. Initially, we had a lot of, we faced a lot of challenges. I think one thing as an organization that we try to do at both organizations, with in this case, Employ America, is we take pride in being kind of wonky and like really knowing the details. And frankly, I think we felt very comfortable going out in the world and making these arguments because substantively we felt very comfortable. And, if you look at, we sent a memo, advocating for this, as I mentioned, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we did a public version of that memo that we sent to the White House. And we really rooted it in an argument of like why this type of policy is important for decarbonization as well. And the point we made is that the super cycle is bad for, energy alternative development, right? And so if you think about, EV adoption, for example, if prices go to 40, it changes the economics of an ICE versus an EV. And I think for us to say, like, there's a consumer welfare benefit from having less volatility. Right now, there are not alternatives, that meet some of the needs that fossil fuels do, right? In terms of, particularly, I think when you get into more electricity and power generation, right? Like countries that are trying to want to develop manufacturing sectors, and you can't, you need firm energy for that. And right now, at cost, like there aren't alternatives. And so I think because substantively, a lot of those things are just true, you have to be just comfortable making those arguments. And I think from our perspective, when we were doing a lot of that work initially, oil prices were at $120, $125. It's that old, like, there's no atheists in foxholes type thing, where frankly, like I was talking to very progressive members who are, hostile to the oil industry, and they were also asking, like, what are we doing to bring down oil prices? My constituents are really suffering. And so I think there's, an inflection moment there that kind of really solidified it for us.
There's actually a lot I think that we'll return to in our talk about having the courage to take a position rooted in wonkiness. There is security in having information and sort of a steadfast commitment to the complexities of reality that I want to return to, because I want to talk, the main reason I wanted to have you on is to talk about your New York Times piece, which I commend you on. It was very well written, and I found very both provocative and compelling. Climate activists need to radically change their approach under Trump. Now, I want to give a preface to our audience that I don't want to have this conversation because I want to bash how the left went too far on A, B, or C. That is not the purpose of this conversation. That conversation is happening everywhere, and I think it's a little too, I think it's even a little overheated at the moment, right? It's a little too like, oh, they went too far, and now it's all over. But what I really want to talk about is what happens, the power of critiquing in group, the power of moving your colleagues and allies to a different place, because it is that same spirit that I want to invoke among industry supporters at this particular moment. And so I just want to be super clear that, like, I'm not here to celebrate like, yeah, they went too far and now we need to move to the middle. I think it's known that I already feel that way. But what I'm curious is, can you talk about why did you write this piece and what's at the heart of your argument?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the argument and then maybe kind of explain why, what the purpose was for writing this is, broadly, I think the argument is we did achieve climate progress under former President Biden. And if you think about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, even though it was a partisan bill, it reflected a diverse set of constituencies that ultimately now is pushing the likely endurance of that law, right? And you're seeing, just today, a new group of Republican House members came out in favor of the Inflation Reduction Act of keeping a number of the tax credits. And so what I think I wanted to, communicate is that that's what success looks like. It is not something that is oppositional. You really have to think about the trade-offs in different policies. And the reason I think that bill is, those bills sustain is that they were not focused on, blocking fossil fuels or like raising the cost of different kinds of projects. They really focus on advancing technological innovation and like creating durable economic incentives for a wide range of stakeholders, from, clean energy producers to manufacturers in the supply chain to fossil fuel companies who could, whose investments in carbon capture could be monetized better. And so, in my view, that takeaway is that like climate advocates need to think about that pragmatic, inclusive strategy if they want, policy to endure. And I think over the past, we don't need to go too into this, but over the past 4 years, I think there were some misplaced priorities too. And I think moving away from some of that, learning from that and seeing what endures, the IRA, I'm optimistic about enduring. The LNG pause, which I substantively think was very misguided, but was a huge priority for a lot of activists, is gone today, it was gone on Monday after inauguration. And so I think, thinking and learning those lessons is really important. And in terms of the why, there's really a schism that has emerged in those working in climate and energy policy about how we pursue decarbonization. I think there's a part of it that is rooted in the environmental movement of the 1970s. It was focused on solving real problems of that time of water pollution, air pollution, how we clean up our physical environment. And that achieved a lot of success, but it was really focused on stopping things. Mm-hmm. And now, there's another group or, set of kind of stakeholders who think about decarbonization really as fundamentally a problem about building new infrastructure, an mm-hmm. investment problem. And how we make that possible, a world of abundant energy where individuals can flourish, that requires us to build. And any election is a natural inflection point where, you have new strategy and new priorities. And my goal with the piece was really to create a permission structure for that second, to join that second group. If you care about climate, there are policies, things you can advocate for that might not intuitively or historically have seemed pro-climate, but are, and that's how we kind of move forward in this moment.
I like that. It's an interesting thing that I'm very conscious of in my work as well. You called it a permission structure. I call it creating cover. Like, where do you get enough, sort of a critical mass of people doing something that was once seen as politically like untenable, and it becomes the obvious next step, right? The obvious next thing. And in this particular moment, it feels to me like environmental and climate activists are sort of falling into two camps. One, let's just see let's get done anything we can get done under Trump. Let's protect IRA. Let's that sort of like incremental progress. And then, of course, naturally another group that's just going to be like double down on war. This will be great for fundraising or whatever. And like hold some line to fight another day. What kind of feedback are you getting on the piece? Like, did people just come out and like burn you, and disown you, or are people like, yeah, if that makes sense, thanks for the cover? Well, like, what's the range of reactions you've been getting?
I mean, I think you covered it. I mean, there was certainly a number of folks who came out. Look, I think to your earlier point, like there's, I wanted to try to be careful and not add to like the chorus of just like left punchers and like people. Mm-hmm. And I think there was, there were certainly folks who came out saying anything about fossil fuel, much more oriented towards the keeping, like we have to stay on, keep it in the ground, like we need to keep that kind of a strategy, and that any concessions to the oil industry are negative. Again, I think I also received a lot of positive reinforcement. Mm-hmm. And I think, there are, groups, activists, policymakers, all who reached out and said, even just like people I know who are not in this space at all, who said like, I've been feeling very dejected, but like this really made me feel good that there's like hope and there's something we can do. And there's like a more constructive way to participate here. I think, there has generally been, when you think about folks who work in energy policy, and, I would say I work in energy policy and not I work in climate policy. But obviously there's some overlap, particularly, on the left. And I think there's a bit of a vacuum there where people looking for energy policy just ended up talking to the climate policy folks. And here, creating a permission structure, new groups can hopefully start up and kind of align with some of these ideas. And I feel confident that at least there's some, germination there.
You raise a really interesting point, and it's one of the things I'm actually hopeful about. My version of your piece, which is to my own group, is about I think there's an inevitable rise of energy of climate pragmatism or environmental practicality, but we only get to participate in sort of that incremental progress, having energy policy conversations, not just climate policy conversations, if we also meet the moment halfway, and in some kind of moderation. I'm just going to go wildly off our planned discussion topic and just throw something out at you. I have a hypothesis, and it's because I'm an absurd optimist. So that caveat aside, that socially we could perhaps make more progress on climate action, on reducing emissions in America under Trump, because it could become less stigmatized among the right. Like if we just said it makes good sense, like reducing emissions makes good sense, mitigate your risk, increase diversity of energy and technological solutions, build more stuff, all the stuff. And it just wasn't this all or nothing, fossil or no fossil narrative, that we could actually do what we did a few years ago when we converted a bunch of coal fired to natural gas. And we all love to say that wasn't climate action. That was just good energy abundance and good sense. And so I could imagine a world where we make more progress. What do you think? Possible?
I mean, only Nixon could go to China, right? I think that's I think it starts with a lot of the stuff that's already in place, right? And I think, I certainly wouldn't say any names. I've got friends who are joining the administration, people who are, secret IRA champions, right? And secret fans. And like, they wouldn't admit it, but there's interests here that are that would like to sustain this stuff. I think there's also a couple of tailwinds that are important to, that I think Trump could take advantage of, but also like they're just macro tailwinds in a sense that could, make the next 4 years look really good. One is, following COVID, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is this government, national government effort across the world to like decouple and like increase your resilience and reduce these vulnerabilities. And that should, lead to investment in different sectors. I personally would love to see, Germany shift away from restarting coal plants and like, maybe have a nuclear renaissance. I don't know if the politics will work for that, but like there are things like that could happen. And then secondly, I think interest rates hopefully will come down. I mean, I don't want to, look too far. There's inflation risks always, and there's different challenges. Who knows what the economy will look like? But the first Trump administration was a big boon for renewable energy sources, and a huge part of that was because interest rates were so low, and you had a lot of investment. And so, I think there really is a lot of stuff that could be capitalized on, and I feel good that critical minerals, geothermal energy, nuclear sectors like that Republicans are more comfortable with, they'll keep the investments there and see it as like really a national security, energy security strategy.
That's really interesting. One of the things I think went terribly wrong in the last, 4 to 8 years is where oil and gas became the climate villain of choice, right? So even my ski lift mate who just said we have to get off oil and gas today. It's just such a oversimplification caricature of an easy villain. And what do you think is required, both of the industry, but also of climate hawks, environmental activists? What's required to move beyond that? Because I think it's actually a huge obstacle to industry engagement, because you're just when everything is your fault, it's just so hard to engage in a constructive way. You just by definition are defensive. Like I felt wildly defensive, and this is what I do for a living. What do you think is there a world where oil and gas could be something other? Maybe not the hero, right? I mean, I don't think this a sort of like drill baby drill narrative is constructive either. What do you think would be required? Can you imagine a world where we just move beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to climate activists, energy policy people, I think what is required is groups like ours and others to really, I mentioned like engage in that substantive debate and like socialize it more, and acknowledge the role that oil and gas producers play in the global economy and the value that they add, right? Like ultimately people demand this stuff one way or another. And hopefully that leads to different policy choices that, like, if you want that demand to go down, you need to think about how you encourage, the alternatives to become the defaults. And I think that opens up a different, policy advocacy avenues. When it comes to the industry, I think I don't know if this would change it. I'm hopeful that this could change it, is that I'd like to see two things. One is a more concrete vision for what role the industry can play in a managed transition, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, we're getting there, but there's still a long way to go. And, that's something I would like to, for example, the advocacy we've done on oil price stability, right? Like, what are you as an oil industry, as a company, as a, industry lobbyist, whatever it is, what role are you playing in kind of furthering that conversation, right? Rather than just the like drill baby drill, like focus on leases, focus on permitting. Like, I think, your audience is savvy enough to know that permitting processes, like certainly it's something we want to make easier if you want more development. But the thing that holds back investment in the shale sector is the market, right? It's also true in natural gas. Like this is, I think that the focus on LNG export permitting is so misguided because, we've got billions of cubic feet per day permitted for export terminals that are not being built because the market won't sustain them because investors don't want to do that. And so I'd like to see, some more focus on those factors from a industry perspective. The other thing I would say, the second, is a stronger role in investing in the market of the future that will help us decarbonize, right? And that means, the oil industry has so much expertise, so much, also has capital for investment and everything from technological innovation, acceleration, financing expertise for energy projects, managing risks associated with geopolitical instability, logistical risks of commodity markets. These are all things that I'd love to see that expertise and experience shared with, the decarbonized industries or decarbonization industries as well. You see some players making limited equity investments in Fervo and Sage and, next-gen geothermal companies. Can we scale that up? Can we make it something where, next-gen geothermal is almost like a hedge for oil producers in a different, in a role where oil demand is uncertain? I think there are leaders here, Vicky Holub is, a leader for envisioning a carbon-constrained future, trying to find a way for Occidental to be a leader there. She's, already blazed so many trails as, a woman in the industry, but she's also doing it in imagining a different future. And so I think taking lead from people like that would be great as well.
You make such an interesting point, and I think at its heart will be that both sides need to move together toward the middle. I was also thinking of Vicky Holub as you were talking in her carbon management, and I had covered how she appeared on my Climate Journey podcast, and the audience just went nuts, right? About how dare you feature an oil and gas company? And I just thought there's just no, the incentive structure for an oil and gas leader to engage in that kind of visionary, let's say we're crossing sides. I hate it is that you have to have so much courage, and then there's very little positive feedback. But I do think we're making progress, and there's some great examples. I also covered recently on a solo podcast I did that Darren Woods, the CEO of Exxon at COP, gave, I thought, a very compelling narrative that under every IEA scenario, he has a way for his company to make money. And I was that sort of transcends the good guy, bad guy, and just says as the world is charting its course, we have a way to be successful in it. Is it visionary where climate leadership is first and foremost? No, but it does chart a path. It does chart a leadership investment path. So these are really interesting things, and we need more players moving to this fertile ground that you describe. Let me pivot us into my next book, because this is really everything we're discussing is at the heart of it. So the basic theme is it's about a moment, and the moment is where civic and business leaders understand the energy transition is going to be hard. It's not simple. It's not a one-liner. It's not you set goals and it magically happens. It's not just a matter of political will. There's markets, there's technology, all the things you know. Now, before November's election, this book was really about as left-leaning or climate-centric, maybe blue state leaders understand that the energy transition is hard, there's a real opportunity for oil and gas leaders to participate in the ways you describe by narrating an industry role in a decarbonizing future. Now that President Trump is now in office, and the results of the election actually make this a little more complicated because now there's sort of this literally an industry commentator is now saying the energy transition era is over. We've moved on to other things. So there's almost this rebellious, we're done with that climate stuff, which I think is wildly imprudent, shall we say?
Yes.
I'm curious, first of all, of your assessment. Do you see some reckoning on around climate leadership that's like, this is going to be hard. We need to get more serious. If we actually want to reduce emissions in a meaningful, scalable way, we need to get serious. Do you see some of that dawning on the left? One, and then two, do you worry that decarbonization is facing like a big brick wall right now? Like, I thought it was just wildly inevitable, and now I'm really saying I want to make sure that it's true that it's wildly inevitable. I'm curious your thoughts on that spectrum of responses to the moment.
Yeah, I think there is there's clearly a rethink happening. I think in terms of, if you look at conversations in the Democratic Party in wake of the election, there's certainly conversations about how to think about climate change advocacy, climate strategy as a priority amongst many others. Mm-hmm. And, I think I mentioned that point about, for all intents and purposes, energy policy was climate policy, I think, in the Democratic Party to a large extent. And that, I'm painting with a broad brush. Obviously, there's different constituencies, but I think largely that's been kind of the norm. And I think there's practically the Inflation Reduction Act was not that type of a strategy. Senator Joe Manchin really pushed for this to be, about energy security and not just about climate change. And so I think, that rethink will continue. In the Republican, I work with a lot of Republican offices, and I think there's also, there's this looming like China competition aspect to it. And, whether or not we like take a very moralistic view about climate change, there are countries, economies, consumers around the world are demanding something better because their air is dirty, and they want to be able to breathe, and they don't want pollution in their countries, and they want responsible but real economic development. And the role that the U.S. plays in that is really a question of how much we invest, domestically and in these technologies, right? I think, if you take something like next-gen geothermal energy, if we can commercialize that here and export it, like that's a real boon for a lot of countries that want clean, firm energy, and we should be taking advantage of that. So I think there is, there's always like a conversation that happens 30,000 feet above, and how much things actually change, I'm not sure. I saw there's this climate bank. I'm trying to remember the acronym for it. I'm forgetting. But like a bunch of the big banks had this climate group.
The Net Zero Alliance.
The Net Zero Alliance. Thank you. And it's like, I was, when they joined the Net Zero Alliance, I was like, yeah, is this really going to be anything? And now they're left, and like, is it going to be anything? The fundamentals driving all this stuff are still there. And so, I think there's a lot of conversations happening, but I think generally there are incentives pushing us towards decarbonization that are more likely.
That's interesting. You say two things that I'm picking up on that I want to weave into my upgraded thinking around this, because if you stop assuming that decarbonization is inevitable, then it does raise the question, well, why would oil and gas companies essentially go away from their core business, which is hard enough. Like, let's be clear. It's like hard enough to run an oil company or gas pipeline or anything like this. These are real competitive, difficult businesses. And then you try to add on like all this other new businesses, innovation. But there's two, I think, interesting things you said. One is just a hedge on innovation, a hedge on what's coming next, a hedge on what people will require. I think that's smart. And that's what you would do anyway, right? If this weren't politicized, you would be thinking about what are the business models of the future? What are the competitive energies of the future? Just smart, just good business. But the second thing you said is that perhaps we're about to enter an era, and I think this speaks to that sort of practical environmentalism, where climate is one of many trade-offs we're considering around energy and environment. And so it's footprint, right? Like, how big of a space are you going to take up in a land-constrained world? How much water? What are the other pollutants that 10, 15 years ago, the main driver was pollution, just the visible pollution or health driven pollution. So in a world where there's a whole bunch of other trade-offs that are considered around energy, environment, and climate is one of many, there's still a lot of incentives, right? Ultimately, usually there's some co-benefits around reducing carbon emissions with among other trade-offs. So I think you make two good reasons why companies need to be steadfast in their thinking, but actually perhaps even more expansive. Like for 5 years, we didn't talk about wildlife corridors, but when I was at the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, that's like the only thing I worked on was like wildlife corridors. And so it's really interesting that we may actually have the luxury of more thinking about more kinds of trade-offs as well. Any reaction to all that?
Yeah, I think, I have this sense, certainly, I think, and people may agree or disagree, but like it does feel like something globally is becoming a bit more chaotic, right? That might be entirely a media fiction that I've invented, but there's just a lot happening. And I think resilience is something, a theme that, we talk about in the context of supply chains, but is a broader theme that companies, countries, individuals are going to have to wrestle with more. I mean, we're seeing with insurance markets, right? And like there's just a lot of potential redundancies or things that need to be built into our decision making in order to, be resilient in a global economy if you're a company. And so I think that I love the point you made about the Exxon CEO of like every scenario I can make money. Like I think really charting that path, and ultimately it requires some investment up front. And obviously, there's going to be different calculations about how much that is. But fundamentally, I think everyone is going to have to wrestle with what it looks like to succeed as a business, as a nation. And if you can, focus on resilience, I think, maybe in the next 3 years or 5 years, you won't see that payoff. But I think in 10, 20, 30 years, like the companies that made those investments will survive.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's it's really great. I appreciate your perspective on this is really important, because this is the cool thing about what we're talking about is, as chaotic as the world feels, is it does feel like every option is on the table. Every solution is on the table. Like the upside of chaos is like the opportunities for success abound. And so I enjoy the way that you think about it in this sort of macroeconomic sense as well. So I want to give you a chance to have the last word here. In all these things that we're talking about, what are you most optimistic about?
What am I most? I'm going to say 3 things. I'm going to cheat a little bit. One is I'm optimistic about the Inflation Reduction Act largely staying in place. I mean, I think there's going to probably be changes at the margins and, all of that politically jogging. But I do believe fundamentally that the coalition on which that was built can endure this moment. Second, I am optimistic that the president wants to refill the SPR. And I hope that, I disagree with him, I guess, that we should refill it fully. I think there's like valuable asset in the storage space. I hope that they can do it in a smart way. One thing I would just add there is like Congress needs to appropriate money to the DOE to acquire. It doesn't have any money to acquire the SPR. So that's another thing. And then finally, I would say we got so close to permitting reform in the last Congress, and we kind of have to start anew, but we built, there's always like things to build on and a new coalition to build on. We had a real close shot there. And I think given that there's a Republican administration, maybe there'll be more of a priority on that. So I'm optimistic about getting somewhere on permitting reform in the next 2 to 4 years.
I love that. Well, Arnab, thank you for your courage in speaking to your own colleagues. Thank you for your courage in speaking to an audience of, oil and gas villains. I really look forward to what the future brings. And you have an open invitation to come back with commentary on what's happening as we unpack all the exciting adventures that await us in the next year. Thanks for joining me on Energy Things.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
That's our episode for today. Thanks so much to our listeners for your engagement. And I'm so thankful that Arnab joined me. I'm really interested in this idea of enduring positions, enduring strategy, enduring policy. There's something about a middle path. There's something about the hedge. There's something about incremental progress, which all speak to my just general optimism about the world and humanity and what we can get done. I started that conversation a bit despondent about everything going on in the world, and I left super energized and empowered that we as individuals have agency. We have agency in this moment to be a part of creating solutions, part of finding middle path, part of hedging and not overcorrecting in our strategies and positions. So I hope that you found it inspiring too. Please take a moment and rate this podcast to help others in the oil and gas industry find us. And if you like this kind of conversation, I hope you'll go to energythinks.com and subscribe to my weekly newsletter. Both of these things are true. I'd like to thank my colleague, Kayla Chives, for making all things Energy Thinks possible. Until next time, I'm Tisha Schuller, wishing you and yours happiness, prosperity, and good health.